something which looks like sedition because it involves bullying of the parliament, bullying of the judiciary, lots of stuff going on which is held at arm's length by the will of the people. I think we should be looking at this very hard in this context because the things are on a knife edge here.
Thank you very much for that, David. How
Yeah.
do you respond to that?
You're making a leap that I didn't make, which is the connection between the Brexit campaign, if you like, and sedition. My argument was that from the historical record, you'll very often find that where an external power is trying to influence events, they look internally to see, is there a group on the inside, which perfectly properly, for perfectly democratic reasons, may well take a view that more suits their agenda. And then the crucial question is there covert support and financing of that group from outside? That would breach our electoral law. That, I hope, is what the Electoral Commissioner, Sir John Holmes, is currently looking at with a team to establish, is there evidence of that? Because if there is, it's extremely serious. There may not be. There may not be. It may be that the Russian attempts to influence the Brexit referendum may turn out simply to have been the same sort of tactics as were used in the United States, which is you set up fake websites, you push material through, and you hope that if you focus on marginal areas, that will make the difference. So I don't have the evidence really to make the jump that you're making, but I think it's the right question to ask, and I certainly hope people are really addressing it. One of the problems is, where's the evidence? And the evidence probably is in Facebook and Twitter and the big. Have they revealed that evidence yet? There has been a lot of debate about, although they provided a lot of support to Bob Mueller's investigation and have provided information there, have they provided our own parliamentary committee that's looking at all of this with that kind of detail? If not, they jolly well should.
It seems there's a certain reticence on the part of Zuckerberg, who's had to have several letters written to him encouraging him to show up in London. I can't see that happening. We had another question over here, person with the glasses just over here, and then this gentleman here.
Possibly an impossible question, but
the best sort.
Broad sweep. If Russia gets better at this, because you're saying some people were becoming incredibly efficient at understanding advertising and how to push the message and so on, presumably many governments could then get better and better at it. And given that we don't have any particular particular authority that says, well, this one's fake and that one isn't, this is fake news and this isn't, then can you see how you can put everything back into Pandora's box? Can you see any way in which, I don't know, some kind of unilateral disarmament on this level can be, where everyone agrees not to do it? Or I don't know. I'm just asking the question of, where do you see this going?
It's a very good question. I mean, the question of whether really this can ever come to an end, or whether we're stuck with it for good.
Let me throw out a few thoughts on that. The first is, Russia's not alone. In the article I wrote, I also singled out the so-called Islamic State, Daesh, which is directly involved in a sedition and subversion, trying to persuade groups here in the United Kingdom to support their ideology and indeed to conduct violent acts in support of it. Sort of classic case, using some very sophisticated video and internet material, some of which has now been demolished, I'm pleased to say, by the combined efforts of Western intelligence agencies. So I don't want to be read as simply highlighting Russia. They got there first, I think. Nor do I want to be portrayed as that Russia is all-powerful and necessarily terribly well organized. The Mueller indictment from the US points out there were two separate Russian groups simultaneously trying to attack the Democratic National Committee, which doesn't sound to me very efficient, and apparently without knowledge of each other. So they're not. This is not all necessarily centrally directed with a mastermind in the Kremlin.
Yes, it's a rather odd, dissonant image that we have of Putin and the character and the Russian sort of central authority. That on the one hand,
I think a better model is to think of the president surrounded by, if you like, a Byzantine court of rich people on whom he relies, and they rely on him, rather than Putin in charge of a Western-style democratic structure where everything gets authorized and so on. But the point about if Russia can do this, so can other people, is undoubtedly true. The Chinese have indeed put some toes in this water, and I would expect them to do more, particularly in relation to their interests regionally. But what we should also remember is a phenomenon I call auto-intoxication. It's not just foreign governments that can do this to us, we can do it to ourselves. And part of the political process these days is precisely that. Isn't this the smart way to win elections? You know, buy the data, use the data in this way, push out stories whether they're true or not, and make sure they get retweeted and so on. And you can see some of this in the Trump administration. I hope we won't see much of it over here, but it is a danger that the very techniques and methods that make digital subversion powerful are ones that can be used perfectly legitimately by democratic parties inside.
And that answer is rather worrying. If you go back to the original question, you seem to be suggesting that not only are we stuck with it, but we're gonna be the ones doing it here at home, and it won't necessarily have to come from without.
That takes you onto the agenda. What do we do about it?
Yes.
And I would broadly say there's an all-of-nation agenda where the private sector, government, academia have got to work on some of these issues.
Let's hold that thought, because I think that's a big one, and we're going to come to it in a second. I just want to hear what this gentleman has got to ask, and then maybe we can come back to that theme.
Thanks. John Lloyd from the FT and Reuters Institute. How far is this asymmetric? I mean, how far are we, the West, doing anything about it? Are we responding? There's not much point in trying to influence Russian elections since they're already fixed. But can we do something else? Can we try to destroy reputations? And you know that Putin regards this insofar, at least implicitly, sometimes almost explicitly, as a return match on his side for what we do through NGOs and so forth. And he has clamped down on NGOs, so has Viktor Orban. They see this as Western infiltration and illegitimate meddling with their culture, their politics. What do you say to that?
There isn't an ethical symmetry. There is an asymmetry just of facts on the ground, that the BBC can broadcast into Russia when it's not being jammed. But RT has a much more effective way of pushing material, particularly on the internet, and us. We're a free society. I certainly don't support ideas that you somehow ban RT. You know, we need a plurality of ideas, and people have the right to choose it. What I object to is the covert bit, which is manipulation. Now, President Putin is on record as accusing us being Western intelligence agencies, of the Panama Papers episode, that somehow that those documents about financial transactions were stolen by Western intelligence and then made public in order to undermine him and his cronies. I've not come across a shred of evidence of this, and indeed the journalists who have been responsible for exploiting all of that have been adamant in their denials that they had any help. They didn't need it. It was a straightforward piece of investigative journalism. But there's no doubt that in the Kremlin, this was taken as a hostile act. The pushing of, if you like, the British culture, Shakespeare and all the rest of it by the British Council is likewise seen as potentially hostile to Russia's soul. And, you know, you have this battle for Russia's soul. The political process in Russia does appear to be a form of political theatre rather than a properly managed democratic process. So the outcome is already known, but you have the theatre of opposition and rallies and all the rest of it. So the niceties are satisfied. And that's not a satisfactory position. I think, John, you may be fundamentally right in that the mindset is defensive. So if you look at what are the prevailing narratives that RT push out, one is Russia as the victim. So there is the victim mentality that we exploited them at the end of the Cold War. We took advantage of them. Another is that we are currently engaged in trying to diminish the status of Russia as a global power. President Obama, I think, really offended them when he described Russia as a regional power. They don't want to be seen as a regional power. They want to be seen as a global power that does global deals with the United States. And those two narratives have been conveyed very powerfully, it appears, to the Russian people themselves, along with the message that if you want stability, if you want Russia to be back as a major player, for example, look at what's going on in Syria and the Middle East. Russia is exercising her influence. If you want that, there's only one choice, which is to continue with the strong leadership of the president.
And the end result of that is a fairly toxic proposition. And Nick Carter, the Chief of the General Staff, he said earlier this year that Russia presents, quote, the most complex and capable security challenge we have faced since the Cold War. And do you go as far as Nick Carter on that?
I certainly come close to that in that it's quite difficult to manage it, to know what to do. There is another dimension to this that doesn't get the airtime, which is about crisis instability. You know, for years and years and years, NATO and the Soviet Union matched each other. The nuclear doctrines kind of intersected in such a way that it was quite stable. And I, for one, never feared that Moscow would order some military adventure onto NATO territory, because the result would have been a lateral escalation right across NATO, with the supreme commanders of NATO taking on the Russians, Soviet Union, and that could only have one outcome, which would be major war, which is the condition, only condition in which anyone's going to use nuclear weapons. So, you know, you don't take the first step, and so it's a very effective mechanism for preventing all major war, because you can't take that first step. Now, one of the great problems which has emerged with the current Russian doctrine of hybridity, whatever you want to call it, is that it could lead them to believe that in somewhere like one of the Baltic states, where there are significant Russian minorities, you could actually have a little adventure. You could send in little green men, as in Crimea, You could foment some discord. You could then have patriotic volunteer forces cross the border to support the minority. And NATO wouldn't be able to react. NATO would simply say, well, we'll have to talk about this. UN Security Council, you've created a situation on the ground, a fait accompli on the ground. Now, that is not actually how NATO would respond, as we've seen from the Cardiff summit onwards. And so this would represent a colossal miscalculation, which could potentially get us into war. Now, that I think is a development that I regard as very serious, very alarming, and you could say it's a deliberate policy to keep us on edge. You could say it's a deliberate policy to frighten us away from forward deploying forces into the Baltic states, which we've done, including British Army units. Or you could say this is the prelude to beginning to undermine the Article 5 commitment, the totality of that, which has been the kind of bedrock of NATO.
Don't you think
If that happened,
yes, sorry, carry on.
and NATO did not respond very powerfully and strongly, that would be the end of NATO. Who would benefit from that?
But isn't there a sense, though, that Putin has had his fingers quite badly burned on account of the poisoning of Sergei and Yulia Skripal in Salisbury? When Litvinenko was poisoned, there was a huge amount of hot talk that came from a lot of our international allies, but in the end there wasn't that much of a reaction. Not so this time, and so perhaps his ambitions, certainly as regards the Baltic states and so on, will be somewhat cooled.
I mean, I would like to think that's right. It may be right. It's certainly the case that the collective solidarity shown by so many countries, over 30 countries, very quickly, saying there is no reasonable alternative explanation that anyone has produced other than that Russia is responsible for the attempted murder of the Skripals. That the reason for that is not because these countries love the United Kingdom and had particular sympathy with the plight we found ourselves in. It's because they probably had enough of being pushed around by Russia, particularly the European nations over what has happened in Ukraine. So if the Kremlin interpret it that way, then maybe the right kind of signal is sent back. Of course, there's a lot we don't know about the Skripal case. We don't know who gave the order. The timing in relation to the presidential election was probably entirely coincidental. Otherwise, it's quite difficult to explain why would you do that just before an election. But I can't envisage an alternative explanation that makes any kind of sense, whatever, other than that the Russian state was in some way involved, because these nerve agents, would be extremely well protected and available only to the organs of the state.
Of course. Now, I wonder whether there are any more questions, any audience members, if you'd like to come in. Yeah, we have, sorry, there's somebody just I can see in the back there with the glasses there on the right-hand side. Thank you, Saskia, thank you.
Good evening. Jeremy Nelson-Smith. I'm just a humble prospect reader.
It's a pleasure.
I'm worried about two things. One, particularly what we've been talking about, in other words, the increasing scale of interference by by Russia. What scares me more is what I've been reading from some well-informed sources in the UK, that the scale of our defence, and I'm referring largely, I guess, to GCHQ and other sources, the ability of for us to defend ourselves in a cyber way is nothing short of feeble. Is that true? Do you think that if they really turn the heat up, if they really turn the wick up on what they wanted to do, then we would be ill-equipped to actually defend ourselves?
Well, it's a bit of a direct challenge to your former employers, David.
Yes.
What do you think to that?
But two things. We are actually better placed than many countries. So because we have some very good people, they are now organised in the National Cyber Centre down the road in Victoria. We've got a decent strategy, people are following it. So we're much better off than many countries are. But the truth is, we sleepwalked our way into the internet. We connected everything up. Governments put all their services and back offices on the internet. Companies happily got rid of large chunks of staff, as did the banks. Everything went online on the assumption that the internet is basically a benign environment. Now we know it definitely isn't. It's filled with criminals, and quite sophisticated criminals, and it's filled with hostile states. Now, if you look at our critical national infrastructure, we have the advantage of having spent many years with the Security Service, MI5's Centre for the Protection of National Infrastructure, working hand in glove with the utilities, electricity, power, gas, etc., against the terrorist threat. Now the threat vector has moved slightly, it's now in cyberspace. That role is now being taken by the National Cybersecurity Centre. It's going to take a long time to secure our basic infrastructure because some of it's quite old, investment costs a lot of money, and some of the security measures you really want introduced will only come when there's reinvestment.
So it sounds like our questioner is correct.
We are vulnerable.
in what you're suggesting. Yeah, we are really open.
Open is probably not the right word, but we are vulnerable. One of the things that can be done, of course, is to monitor the internet itself and to gather intelligence on countries that have a motive for trying to attack us. That's where GCHQ and its intelligence gathering comes in. You need the partnership with the private sector, because in the end, it's the private sector that runs the critical infrastructure, not government. They're up for that. They had excellent cooperative arrangements with government to match first the provisional IRA, then the Salafist jihadist threat, now the cyber threat. That puts us in a very much better position, for example, than the United States, where relationships between industry and the federal government are not as close, and it's a bigger country. They, I think, have a much greater problem in securing their critical infrastructure. But the intelligence gathering does show that China, Russia, possibly one or two other countries have been actively exploring our infrastructure and American infrastructure, looking for weaknesses, looking for vulnerabilities. Now, one of the things that as a nation we can do, which would help on the intimidation agenda, is to become more cyber secure. Now, a big part of that is people. So actually, people behaving less stupidly on the internet. This is a big ask. It involves people not taking shortcuts, being sensible about passwords. It involves being much more careful about the ways in which an adversary can try and get into a system. So how did the Russians get into the Democratic National Committee? They sent out spear phishing emails and somebody clicked on one. So there's quite a lot we can all do to actually be much more careful online. And that will help a bit.
Do you think it's going to take some government regulation as well, and that's quite a big question, isn't it? I mean, because as you were saying, the Silicon Valley evangelists of the 1990s were selling us a great kind of open, happy online ecosystem.
It's important not to oversimplify the problem. If you take the Russian attack on the Ukrainian electricity system around Kiev, it had two components. One was quite a detailed hack into the actual control systems. So the people operating the electricity distribution company could see the cursor moving about the screen as if by automation, one by one, switching off all the relays to turn off the lights. But the other part of it was a denial of service attack against the companies so that the customers couldn't find out what was going on and couldn't contact the companies because they flooded them with hundreds of thousands of pings. Now, that kind of attack is very easy. You can buy that on the dark net, very cheap. You just rent the capability of 100,000 servers to fire this at a bank or a company or if you publish an article people don't like, well, bang, you're cut off from your consumer base.
We've had some trouble on that front in the past.
And of course, when you immediately start to look at those sorts of things, cameras, microphones, children's dolls that you can program so the family can speak to the child, door locks that open from outside, electrical kettles that can be switched on from outside, fridges that will reorder milk when you run low, all of the Internet of Things, hundreds of thousands of these things. Very few have been sold with upgradable security. It's a colossal market failure because there's no economic incentive on the manufacturer to put security in because the device still works, even although when you're not looking, it's firing messages on behalf of somebody else, some criminal gang, at the target. Now that's a very good example where you need regulation. So basically, such devices should not be importable into the UK without upgradable security. And I would hope that would be a European Union regulation. There are many reasons why it would be a good idea to continue to be a member of the European Union, because you can pass those sort of regulations much more easily to 28 than as one country. Could get a more level competitive playing field amongst the people who make them. But I would be very cautious now about the idea you buy a device in your home which is connecting to the internet when you don't know it is.
And the big, two of the largest repositories of data are Google, the other one is Facebook. And these two colossal companies that are sitting right there in the middle of the most important piece of infrastructure we have in the modern world. I mean, what can governments realistically do to I don't know, almost to ally themselves with Google and Facebook? I mean, it's a term that you would normally use for states, but I mean, they're so enormous and powerful that seems apposite, especially if Mark Zuckerberg won't even bother to show up in Parliament to talk to select committees and so on. It's rather suggestive of the power dynamic, isn't it?
You'd have to add Amazon as well.
Yes, yes.
One of the largest cloud providers on the planet. No, I don't know the answer to that. I don't think anyone really knows the answer to that. What does seem to be the case is they sit up and take notice when the share price goes down. So there is potentially leverage over these companies through reputational damage. And if it does look as if they behaved without due diligence, for example, Facebook, in terms of allowing people to, friends of friends, to authorize data to be passed to third parties, then that's a hit on the company and they will probably do something about it. But you know, it's the law of Northern California that these companies, you know, are judged by. That's where their litigation takes place. Again, I think where you have a very large customer base, as in the European Union, you have more leverage than a single country has. But in the end, it's the commercial incentives that I think will drive these companies to be more responsible.
Yes. Now we have one or two other questions. We had a gentleman right here in the front row. Thank you, Saskia.
Going back to the question of cybersecurity, is it too naive to wonder whether there might be situations where attack is the best form of defence? I mean, one would, be, in a way, be quite pleased if the intelligence services had had a hand in the Panama Papers as a form of deterrence, perhaps.
Yes, although that would actually illustrate how difficult it would be to predict what the impact is going to be of your action. So for short-term tactical reasons, you might say that's a great idea. It will really embarrass them in the Kremlin. But if the result is some long-term damage to the relationship, maybe you'd be better off with that. But I was very pleased to see that one of my successors as director, making a speech recently pointing out the work that had been done to attack back to Daesh. So making it extremely hard for the Salafist jihadists to get their material out into the internet, because no doubt every time they, as it were, turned on and tried to push in, the GCHQ or NSA or one of the other agencies working on this had got there first.
Okay, so there's an interesting distinction there. When it's a state actor, that's one thing, but when it's a non-state actor, you might feel moved to...
Not necessarily the distinction I would make. It's about predictability.
Right.
Can you really be sure, if you hit a state, what you're hitting and what the implications are going to be? You don't want to turn out the lights in the local hospital. You know, if it's one of the few norms that exists in this area, from the work NATO has done, is that international humanitarian law applies in cyberspace as it does in the 3 dimensions of the ordinary world. So if the Royal Air Force is not allowed, as they're not, to go and bomb a hospital, you're not allowed to cyber attack in such a way that you knock out a hospital. So you have to be a bit careful. The other, I mean, this area bristles with problems. You tip your hand. So the moment you've fired your cyber weapon, it's almost certainly going to get detected and reverse engineered. And the next thing you know, it's going to be used back at you. And the famous Stuxnet case, which I think had 4 zero-day vulnerabilities exploited to allow them to do it, that got reverse engineered. And some of that code has come back to try and attack us. So you have to be a bit careful. The best kind of offensive cyber is the offensive cyber that's there in waiting, where the adversary genuinely believes you have the capacity to turn their lights out, but you don't turn them out because they alter their behavior. So this is kind of from deterrence sort of theory. Once you actually have to do it, I fear it kind of loses some of its efficacy.
And this kind of cyber attack and defense and so on, it's the context in which we're talking geopolitically, I'd say, is rather fraught. I mean, if you consider our relationship with Putin, that's just one of a whole range of different, very worrying developments. I mean, the North Korean apparent rapprochement, I mean, that's great. We will watch that with interest, but it doesn't detract from the fact that, you know, attention now seems to be turning to the Iran deal, and there are all sorts of worries about Trump and how he might act, as well as President for Life Xi in Beijing now. Do you think that when you look at the strongman politics of Trump and Putin and Duterte and in Eastern Europe and so on, are we passing through a moment, or are we entering into a new phase that will last?
Well, I can only have a hunch,
Let's hear it.
which is that it's more than just a passing phase. It's, I think, part of what I see in the internet itself and the web, the immersive nature of those medium, the way in which information, if you like, polarizes. It's the phenomenon of the filter bubble. And so it makes liberal democracy much harder, because people get pushed to the extremes, because that's the reinforcing information which comes to them. And of course, the whole business model of the internet is designed so that you can actually push reinforcing information at the individuals, called advertising. But of course, it doesn't have to be advertising for a product. It can be advertising for an idea. So I think I would worry that it's harder to adjust to the, let's call it polarizing, and that what we've seen with the rise, particularly on the right, more authoritarian regimes, you can make a causal link to the nature of the information space. Now, I may be wrong, that's just a hunch.
Well, does anybody want to come back on that, or are there any questions related to that? We have a gentleman there in the back row with his hand up. Thank you.
My name is Robert McFarland, and another humble prospect reader. I'm surprised that a little bit that the emphasis has been on Russia, and we did just mention China just in the last question, and that seems to be much more dangerous on two grounds. First of all, they are much more plugged in through their foreign investment into the infrastructure of both of here and Western Europe and of the States, except the States are putting up some barriers. But more particularly, of course, is their sort of 1984 type control of in which they have done to Facebook what we are sort of ourselves talking about. And we're talking about state regulation of Facebook. We're not there yet. We think it might not be a very good idea anyway. They think it's a jolly good idea, and they're doing an awful lot of damage in the process in terms of controlling their more prosperous population and feeding ideas from the center. And it's clearly a very powerful weapon in Xing's future. And there he is for life, and the party taking ever greater control. And nothing sounds more absurd now than the assumption that there was no way that communist China could develop towards market economy without gradually introducing some form of democratic representation. That seems ever further away.
It's a very good point, isn't it, that the Chinese have succeeded in taking hold of precisely the digital sphere that we have failed to in the West. Do you think we've got something to learn from them?
Well, we certainly need to pay attention to what they're doing. The focus on Russia in this event is
editorial.
Yes.
Yes.
But let's just consider China for a moment. China offers an alternative model in a way that Russia doesn't. Russia's model is strong president, high levels of corruption. The deal with the people is stability in return for continuing to vote for the president at least until 2024. The Chinese offer a model, an alternative, which is a form of adaptive capitalism, I suppose. But what the people have to give up for the benefits of that they have to give up the what will be seen as the Western frills of liberal democracy. So the extremely sinister development of the social score,
Yes.
where your internet usage is monitored by the authorities. If you go on the right kind of websites and you ask the right kind of queries, that's fine. If you start to look at the wrong kind of websites and dissident material or whatever, then, or express like to the wrong kind of tweet, then you get negative points. And if you have a good score, you're a good citizen, you get access to the best education for your children, you get jobs in local government, and so on. If you get a low score, you're deemed to be antisocial and therefore actively working against the Commonwealth. This is being trialled in China. I don't see anything that will stop them rolling it out. It is an extremely sinister development.
Yes, and rather extraordinarily, it was an idea that was first floated in a television program called Black Mirror. About 5 years ago, it was suggested as a ridiculous and impossible, nightmarish Orwellian future, which has now come to pass. Remarkable.
Yeah, and indeed I saw a play on the subject in London last year, which ran. So you can see that the other factor that is worth bearing in mind is the deterrent effect of economic interdependence. The very fact that China owns large chunks of the United States is stabilizing. And given that they are not, in any case, a regime much prone to adventurism, it's slow, steady progress, building their ring of military bases, and little by little by little. Whereas what I worry about the Kremlin is some terrible miscalculation which plunges us into crisis. So I think you're absolutely right to focus on China, but it will be a different analysis from the Russian analysis in some key respects. The other thing that I might just mention whilst we're on the subject of cybersecurity is the level of criminal activity which there is, and the fact that there is evidence that the criminal groups in Russia are protected by the state, so that they are free to make criminal money during the day, as long as when their controller taps them on the shoulder and says, "No, it's time for you to do something for us." So it would be a mistake to see all of this as Russians, traditional state intelligence agencies. You've got a penumbra of criminal activity. There's a very interesting development going on at the moment by the National Cybersecurity Centre down the road, in which they've taken the subdomain .gov.uk. And we all use .gov because that's where you go to relicense your motor car or contact the authorities or file your tax return. So it's a little subdomain of the big .uk domain. And the experiment at national scale that's being run is to test, could you secure the .gov domain, subdomain, so that you actually make it extremely hard for criminals to try and attack government departments, social security payment systems, the Inland Revenue and so on. And there are apparently hundreds of thousands of attempts every year to defraud us in that kind of way. The early evidence that I've seen is extremely encouraging, that it is actually possible to do that. And to find the bad websites that you think you're logging on to vehicle licensing. You're not. You're logging on to some criminal website that looks the same. All of that kind of thing. You can clean most of that out, you can introduce new kinds of control. For example, you can't, if you're a tax advisor, you can't file your client's tax return unless your software is up to date, because the system can test whether or not you patched your software. So a lot of the problems that come from people not keeping their stuff up to date, patching it, you can get round. Now, if you can do that for .gov.uk, could you apply the same kind of principles to .uk and actually mean that the United Kingdom is actually a domain where you can do internet commerce and all these other things and talk to your friends securely? So, I mean, they've got some very interesting, imaginative ideas, and I say, a big experiment at national scale.
Sure. So one of our questioners back there asked earlier whether or not we were ready for the internet in intelligence terms, and you said that we rather sleptwalked into the internet. Does the same apply for in the criminal sphere as well, or are we more evenly matched in taking care of that particular challenge?
No, I think we were all caught out. Really, and what came, I think, as a slight surprise, although perhaps it shouldn't have done, is that the criminal groups aren't just criminal groups. There are state-sponsored criminal groups, and there are criminal states. So, for example, North Korea attempted to take $971 million off the central bank of Bangladesh. They held their account in New York, and the attackers faked up a series of SWIFT, the interbank payment system, SWIFT orders, saying transfer this money. They got away with about 80 million, I think, before somebody spotted and said, hang on, these are not valid. But it was very clever. And that was probably the North Koreans trying to get foreign exchange to pay for their nefarious activities around the world, because they're under sanction. Now, if a state is prepared to engage in highway robbery, what have we come to?
Saskia, we've got another question just over here, this person over here on the end. Thank you.
Thank you. So I wanted to pick up on your point about economic interdependence, particularly in the area of the technology that governments use to secure themselves. So you talked about the securing of .gov domain. In that case, I think it was a UK tech company involved, wasn't it? It was Nominet. But the thing is about the cyber industry is just how global that is. And in fact, interestingly, large parts of the cyber workforce are Russian nationals. They may be based in the States, but that's a big area of kind of competence. Russia. We look at quite mainstream cyber software companies, Kaspersky, Russian owned. Then we talked about China earlier. China is a really successful exporter of secure comms technology now. Really kind of fundamental stuff underpinning fundamental communications infrastructure of many countries. So, in this very, very kind of global, interdependent, technology world, what chance do governments have really? And I guess following on from that, do you think we'll end up with a government tech procurement strategy which perhaps becomes more nationalistic, more concerned with national security?
I think probably not is the answer. A point I might have made earlier is that this is about managing risk, not about eliminating risk, because the risk we're going to have to live with. You just can't get rid of the risk. A few years ago, it might have been thought that if you had a company and you put firewalls around the company, that somehow that would keep out the bad guys. That has been shown not to be the case. So you have to monitor your networks find out when and if the bad guys get in, and then how you're going to expel them. And you have to compartment your information as a company to make sure that the crown jewels, the results of years and years of field trials of some drug or exploration, aren't on the network, and that you know exactly who is accessing that data because you've got logs that are difficult to fix. So there's a lot that can be done to manage the risk, but you can't eliminate it. The Kaspersky case is a very interesting one because there's been a lot of evidence given to Congress about that. And what they discovered was, I think what was well known, was that the way Kaspersky security works is you buy the product, you install it on your machine, they take your data, download it to Russia, and they have huge databases and they analyze it, and that's how they'll find the malware on your machine. Now, Eugene Kaspersky is on the record as denied vigorously allowing the Russian authorities access to that data. He may well be right. But have they got access to that data? Have they found some backdoor in? Now, that was the risk that the US administration said we can't afford to take. So if you're a US government department, or you have sensitive information and you're in the critical infrastructure and so on, you shouldn't use this product because you can't guarantee that when your data ends up back in Moscow or St. Petersburg, that it isn't going to be accessible by the Russian authorities. So that's a kind of risk management approach. The British government, as far as I know, has said if you're an ordinary user of Kaspersky products, there's nothing wrong with the product. And if you're not nervous about having your data looked at in that way, forget it, just get on. Don't, whatever you do, tear out the Kaspersky product just because of this. But if you're a British government department or you're dealing with sensitive information in industry, you would be better advised not to use it. So that's the kind of risk management approach, which seems to me not unreasonable.
Sure. Now, look, David, I can see from the clock we're getting close to the close. So I think one final question, just to try and draw in some of the themes that you've been outlining this evening. I was very taken with the idea that you put down about how the growth of social media and the internet and the online world has coincided and is possibly causally connected with this rather imbalanced politics that we see. And part of that, I suppose, I think you put down to the detachment from the division between, on the one hand, news, fake news and information, and on the other hand, the truth, which is rather a sort of elemental combination that we've always relied on very heavily, and which is being undermined by fake news and propagandistic output online. And Timothy Snyder in his has written beautifully about this in his latest pamphlet. He wrote particularly that post-truth is pre-fascism, and that was a comment that I cannot get out of my head. I mean, how do you react to that as somebody who's seen this very close up?
I mean, it might be more accurate to say pre-authoritarianism.
Right.
So it doesn't necessarily follow historical patterns. But yes, I have some sympathy with that point of view. The immersive nature of the medium, the way in which the impact that material has is not through rationation, it's through emotional impact. Because so much of it is visual, and so much of it is written, as the best advertisements are written, to have an emotional impact. I mean, when you see a television commercial for a new motor car, what you are perceiving are not rational arguments why their suspension is better than somebody else's suspension. These are emotional arguments designed to resonate with the inner you, whether it's escapist driving at speed down some motorway or picking up the family. So that it's very carefully targeted on groups of users. Now, this is one of the conundrums that since we give our information away, these companies have our information. They have they may well have our browsing history. And the machines, therefore, know more about us than we know ourselves. I can't remember everything I ever bought online, but they will. Why would they forget? They don't forget. So you have this curious situation where the algorithm knows more about me than I do. Therefore, they're probably in a better position to work out what I really want, because they know that I went on some extreme skiing websites and salivated over the latest skiing gear or whatever it is. So if I go on to one of those sites to find a holiday, what will pop up will be, without my asking, those holidays that resonate best with that algorithm's view of my inner desires. And when I pick my holiday, it will feel extremely comfortable and a perfect fit. Why wouldn't it be a perfect fit? Because the machine knows all about me. Now, does that leave you feeling queasy? Or do you just shrug your shoulders and say that's the kind of world we're in? That's about the purchase of a motor car or holiday. Exactly the same processes apply to the purchase of or the acquisition of a political idea. That's what makes me worried about the future of liberal democracy.
Well, David Omand, thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for coming along this evening. David Omand, ladies and gentlemen. And just as I mentioned earlier,